Good evening. China, the rise of China, I would argue, is the most important event in the world since the British Industrial Revolution. And it's going to change the world very profoundly. And it's going to change the world very profoundly in two ways, not one. It's going to change it economically, and I think we can already see this. And secondly, it's going to change it politically, intellectually, morally, spiritually, ethically, militarily, culturally. It's going to change the world in as profound a way, if not more profound way, than the rise of the West has over the last 200 years. Now, first of all, I want to talk about the economic side of it, because that's obviously very fundamental. The rise started in 1978, when China started to grow at about 10% a year. But when it started to grow at 10% a year, it was only 1/20th of the size of the American economy. So the impact of China, even growing at 10% a year on the world, was extremely small. But now China is over half the size of the American economy, and it's still growing very fast, between 7.5% and 8% a year. And it will likely continue to do so. This is the background. Now, there are, I know, it's fashionable, well, actually, I think that sort of the general mentality in the West towards China is what I would describe as a bearish sentiment. In other words, people are always expecting Chinese growth to, at some point, decline and, broadly speaking, as we've known it, end. That has been a constant refrain. And even now, you will have noticed since the financial crisis, a lot of the attention to China is, you know, is it slowing down? Is it going to hit an economic crisis, and so on? Well, of course, China's got big economic problems, huge economic problems compared with what we've got. But the extraordinary thing about China is that since 1978, and it's difficult to know exactly why, but basically it's not had an economic crisis. It's carried on growing at 10% a year for over 30 years. Now, I want to emphasize that the impact of the Western financial crisis on the rise of China, or the relative position of China, to put it more precisely, has been to accelerate China's relative rise. This finishes a bit early. No, I should bring it up to date, but it's 2011, and it over on the left-hand side is the marked 100 is the size of the GDP of most range of Western countries in 2008, and you'll see by early 2011, most of them were still smaller than they were then, and Britain is still smaller than they were then. Now, and America is now a bit bigger, but not much bigger. Now we superimpose China over that period. And you can see China's been growing very rapidly in that period. The economy by 2011 was 1/3 larger than it was in 2008. Now, the effect of this process has been to accelerate China's relative rise compared with the situation in the West. And I don't think really, you know, with all the sort of noise of the media, this is clear in people's minds, that this process has continued and accelerated. And one of the effects of this process is this. In the Goldman Sachs projections, which are widely quoted, I use it in my book, in 2007 it was projected that the Chinese economy would overtake the size of the American economy in terms of GDP by exchange rates in 2027. That was made in 2007. Now, the key figure here, the key thing to look at, is GDP at market rates. This was put together by the economists, and it's a sort of consensus of what's happening. And you'll see all the red lines are where China's already overtaken the United States, and the blue lines are where it's still due to when it's likely to overtake the United States. And the purple line is GDP, and the projection now is that China will overtake the United States in terms of GDP by exchange rates, not in 2027, but in 2018, which is, in historical terms, just round the corner. We're very close to that situation now. And I would argue that actually what's happening now is that China is probably a more important shaper of the global economy, a more important shaper of globalization than the United States. And there are three footprints of China, economic footprints of China, I want to illustrate this point with. The first is, China is a huge trader. It's the second, almost now the biggest, but still the second biggest importer in the world, mainly for commodities. And you have all these commodities for which China's consumption is a very high proportion of global consumption. It is also a huge exporter. Overtook 2 or 3 years ago the United States, which had held the position for 110 years, as the largest producer of manufacturing goods in the world. And China is the biggest exporter in the world. And I just think these figures are so interesting. This is China as a trading partner of the combination of exports and imports of these various countries. Okay, and I've just summarised it. There's a great long list of them. But 1992. For Argentina, China accounted for 1.1% of the trade, of Argentina's trade. And then you'll see a dramatic change in Argentina's case. But what is fascinating is if you go back to 1992, apart from a number of East Asian countries, there were barely any countries in the world for which China was the biggest trading partner, hardly any. And now, now here being 2010, there are many countries for which China is the biggest trading partner. I mean, I don't know whether I've got a light here, have I? Yeah. I mean, Brazil, for decades, America was the largest trading partner. China's overtaken it. It's now 14%. America is around 10%. Obviously, Chile is China is its biggest trading partner. Venezuela. The United States it's either China or it's Canada. They're very close together. I'm not sure it's the largest trading partner for Russia. I think it is now. And then for Pakistan, largest trading partner, India's largest trading partner, China. Egypt, not sure. Saudi Arabia, not sure. South Africa, China's the largest trading partner. All these East Asian countries and Australia. And this is steadily growing. I mean, this is a fantastic transformation in 20 years, and it's growing. I don't think it'll carry on growing as rapidly as it has, because China's exports are not going to carry on growing as rapidly as they have because of the shift towards consumption. But nonetheless, the process will continue. Or take another measurement of China's rise, which is finance. I mean, in 2009 and 2010, between them, the China Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank were responsible for more lending to the developing world than the World Bank. The World Bank, one of the two great institutions of the post-war American world order. And one can see that in time, the World Bank is going to become relatively insignificant, probably, in global terms. It depends a lot on to what extent countries like China and to a lesser extent India and so on put their funds, their money into the World Bank. But I suspect that it'll be much more complicated than that, because I expect there to be a different kind of international economic order as China develops along with other developing countries. But China is the key player, without any doubt, in this respect. Or a third area, which I'm not going to illustrate, but is the rise of the renminbi. I mean, the renminbi, very wisely, against all advice from the West, against the Washington Consensus, the Chinese did not make their currency convertible. Why? Because they wanted to be able to control the development of the Chinese economy free from speculative movements which could derail or destabilize the economy. They never did it. Even now, it is not a convertible currency. Very wise. I assure you the Chinese policymakers are very smart. Very, very smart. And they made a very good strategic decision. But since 2008 autumn, they started to begin to make the renminbi available in the settlement of trade. In other words, paying for their exports and imports. So now it's responsible for quite a slice of its trade, quite a slice of the trade with Africa by China is done in the renminbi. And this is true for Latin America and so on. The renminbi is beginning to become an international currency. In time, down the road, it will become convertible. And when it comes convertible, I think it won't be very long before it displaces the dollar as the dominant reserve currency in the world. I'm not going to fix a time on it, but we're not talking about 50 years. We're talking about, well, it depends when they make it convertible, but within the next 20 years. Within the next 20 years. Maybe much less. I mean, it could be much less, but in my view, if the Chinese, I think, should tread cautiously in this respect. I think they should, they've got other problems, other fish to fry before they start becoming a reserve currency with all that involves. Now, let's raise our sights a little bit more, okay? Let's push the boat out in time terms, the horizon a bit further, and look at these figures that have been compiled by Hu Hongong, who's at Tsinghua University, very good economist, very good economic statistician as well. And these figures are not so different from others that have been put together. But can I draw your attention here to China in 1820 accounted for 1/3 of global GDP. And then it had a horrific decline, what the Chinese call the century of humiliation. You see, and it hits bottom around the time of the 1949 revolution, 4.6% of global GDP, catastrophic decline. In fact, for over a century, Chinese GDP more or less froze, like India's actually, and then began to grow with independence, or in China's case, with its revolution. In India's case, with its independence, and then it starts going. Now, Hu Hongong's done these estimates for 2020 and 2030. These figures, by the way, are GDP according to PPP, primary product. So, purchasing power, primary purchasing power. Sorry, and look at 2030. And Hu Hongong's estimate is that by 2030, China will account for 33% of global GDP. The future is back to the past, if you like, 33.4%. But what's equally fascinating here is America, 15.1%. In fact, its maximum achievement was 27.3. Well, actually, it was higher than that in the Second World War, because so many European countries were relatively knocked out. But 15.1%, Europe 13.1%. You'll note this. China's economy in 2030, which is only 18 years or whatever it is down the road, 17 years down the road, will be twice the size of the American economy and over twice the size of the European economy. So, to proceed, I'll come back to that in a moment. This is what the global economy could look like in 2030. Japan just 3%, Russia 3%, Brazil 5%, countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam and so on 6%, EU 13%, America 15%, India, which I haven't talked about, 19%, and China 34%. And if I paint the picture like this for you, the top one is GDP at current exchange rates, the bottom one is GDP at PPP, and the red ball is China, and the grey silver ball is the United States. And you'll see this extraordinary historical transformation. I mean, we're talking about only 30 years between the red ball being very, very small, almost like, not like the moon around the Earth, to becoming not yet the sun, but I mean much bigger than the American economy. And Danny Quah at the London School of Economics has put this interesting, done some very interesting work on trying to locate the epicenter of the global economy and how it's shifting. And in 1980, he had it, you know, in the Eastern Atlantic here. And then it steadily shifted. And at the moment, he suggests it's just here. And by 2050, he suggests it'll be on the Indian-Chinese border. This is an extraordinary historic shift that's taking place. You know, this was when the world was still dominated by the North Atlantic, in a sense. And this is how it is changing. And it's changing in another sense as well, just to go back to this. And that's this. Look, what characterizes this era is not just the rise of China. It's also characterized by the transformation in the position of the developing world. If you go back to the 1970s, the mid-1970s, the developed world accounted for 2/3 of global GDP, the developing world only 1/3. Bear in mind that 85% of the world's population lives in the developing world, and only 15% lives, roughly speaking, lives in the developed world. By 2000, it was roughly 50-50. Huang Gong's projection is that the developing world will account for 2/3 of global GDP by 2030. So the great transformation we're talking about, in which China is the leader, but is also the exemplar and is part of the wider phenomenon of the rise of the developing world and the decline of the developed world. That is the era that we live in. And the world is being and will be reconstituted by this process. In my view, we will see the existing international institutions either transformed or replaced, or both, is what I suspect will happen, is both. Because the new rising powers will want to constitute the world over time in a different kind of way. So that brings me to the end of my economic paration, because I want to move on and talk about China. What is China? You know, the economic stuff sort of enables us to think that China is very familiar to us and we know what it is and it's going to be like us. I mean, it doesn't, of course, we've got it wrong so many times. But it sort of, there's a sort of ease of translation, or we think there's an ease of translation. Now, what about China as a country, as a history, as a nation? How to understand that? Now, the West has always thought, or has long thought, that there is only one modernity. And that modernity is a Western modernity. And that as countries modernize, they Westernize. They become more and more like us. We're all on the upper escalator. We're just on different steps on that escalator. So as China modernizes, it will become just like us. This is an illusion. This is profoundly wrong. This is based on the assumption somehow the process of modernization is simply a function of competition, markets and technology. It is not. It is also a function of history and culture. China has never been Western. It is not Western now, and it never will be Western. I don't mean that it's not learning like crazy from us. I don't mean that it's not incorporated significant parts of that learning into what China is. But the end product will not be a Western-style country. It will be something different. Now, this is where we're all at sea, because we don't think like this. We think that Western concepts, Western ideas, drawn from our own history, drawn from our experience, can explain what China is. I'm sorry, it only has a limited capacity to do that. And I refer here not just to general, media stuff and so on. I refer to a lot of China scholarship by, China experts in the West. I mean, in varying degrees, but there are great exceptions like Lucien Pai, who I think was a great scholar of China, who was at MIT. Now, what I want to do, the main thing I want to do today, before I get onto the UK and where we're going to be, is to try and give you some building blocks for understanding China. And I'm going to give you, as quickly as I can, 5 key building blocks for understanding China. The first is this. China is a nation state.